The morning of December 7, 1941, began like any other Sunday in paradise. The island of Oahu was still half asleep under the soft glow of the Pacific sun. Palm trees swayed lazily in the breeze, the scent of salt and plumeria hung in the air, and the blue waters of Pearl Harbor mirrored the sky with the kind of peace that only comes before chaos. At Ford Island, sailors in crisp white uniforms walked across the decks of the battleships moored in neat rows. The USS Arizona, Oklahoma, California, Nevada, West Virginia, Tennessee, and Maryland, the pride of the Pacific Fleet, lay anchored like steel giants resting before the next exercise. On shore, church bells were ringing softly from the base chapel, while breakfast kitchens filled the air with the smell of coffee, bacon, and fresh bread. In the barracks, men wrote letters home talking about loved ones, Christmas plans, or a long-awaited transfer back to the mainland. There was laughter, teasing, the sound of gramophones playing swing music. It was just another Sunday. But far beyond the horizon, over the dark waves of the northern Pacific, death was already on its way. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, cut silently through the waves, escorted by cruisers and destroyers. Aboard them were 353 planes, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and the feared Mitsubishi Zero fighters. Every man aboard knew the mission by heart. They were to deliver a surprise strike that would cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet before America even knew it was at war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had planned it with cold precision, though even he feared its consequences. "I fear all we have done," he had written, "is awaken a sleeping giant." But for now the giant still slept. At 6 a.m. the first wave lifted off the carriers. The rumble of engines broke the morning calm over the Japanese fleet. Young pilots adjusted their goggles, tightened their scarves, and set their compasses toward Hawaii. Some smiled nervously, others prayed. The leader, Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, radioed the signal, "Tora, Tora, Tora," meaning the attack had achieved complete surprise. Over the sleeping island, the first golden rays of sunlight met the silhouettes of incoming aircraft. Down below, at Pearl Harbor, the world was peaceful. Sailors lined up for breakfast. The band aboard the USS Arizona was tuning up for the morning flag-raising ceremony. Along the runways at Hickam and Wheeler Fields, rows of American planes, P-40 Warhawks, B-17 Flying Fortresses, sat wingtip to wingtip, parked closely together to prevent sabotage. No one expected an attack from the sky. At 7:02 a.m., 2 American radar operators on the northern tip of the island picked up a massive blip, dozens of aircraft heading straight for Oahu. They reported it to headquarters. The response was casual, "Don't worry about it. It's probably a flight of B-17s coming in from the mainland." The warning died there. Minutes later, the first Japanese planes broke through the clouds. They came low over the green hills, sunlight glinting off their wings, red suns blazing on their fuselages. Farmers and children looked up, puzzled, until the roar of engines became a scream. At 7:48 a.m. the first bombs fell. A torpedo struck the USS Oklahoma, tearing open her side. Another slammed into the USS West Virginia. In seconds, the calm harbor became a cauldron of fire and smoke. Sailors leaped from decks into burning oil-slicked water. Alarms screamed. Anti-aircraft gunners scrambled from their bunks, barefoot, half-dressed, confused. From the Arizona came the sound of general quarters being sounded, too late. A 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb plunged through her deck, igniting her forward magazine. The explosion split the ship in two. A fireball shot hundreds of feet into the air, seen all across Oahu. Men were blown overboard by the blast. A mushroom of black smoke rose over the harbor, so vast it blotted out the sun. Inside the chaos, a young mess attendant named Doris, Dorie Miller, who had never been trained on a weapon, ran to help his wounded captain. Finding him dead, Miller turned toward the ship's anti-aircraft guns. Without hesitation, he began firing at the attacking planes, hitting several before being ordered to abandon ship. His courage that morning would make him the first African-American awarded the Navy Cross. But at that moment he was just another sailor fighting for his life. Across the harbor, men struggled to return fire. The air was thick with shrapnel and screams. The heat from burning oil was so intense it peeled paint from steel. Men were diving into the water only to find it on fire. The Japanese pilots came in waves, torpedo bombers low over the water, dive bombers from above, machine guns raking the decks. The Zero fighters hunted anything that moved, strafing sailors swimming for shore. Aboard the USS Nevada, the crew managed to get the ship underway, the only battleship to do so, But she quickly became the target of every bomber in the sky. Hit again and again, she was deliberately beached to avoid blocking the channel. At Hickam Field, rows of American planes were set ablaze before they could even take off. Hangars exploded. Pilots were killed before they reached their cockpits. Civilians across Honolulu watched in disbelief as fireballs rose in the distance. Some thought it was a drill. Others thought the world was ending. In the control tower, messages went out in all directions. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. In Washington, it was still early morning. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was having breakfast when he received the first report. He read it slowly, his expression darkening. The line that struck him most was short and cold. Attack on Pearl Harbor, this is no exercise. On the island, the second wave was already inbound. The first had crippled the battleships. Now the second would target airfields, fuel depots, and shipyards. Smoke blackened the sky. The thunder of explosions echoed through the valleys. Hospitals overflowed. On the USS Arizona, men were still trapped below deck, banging on the steel as flames consumed the ship. Those sounds would echo in the ears of survivors for the rest of their lives. In less than 2 hours, the Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. 18 ships were sunk or damaged. Over 2,400 Americans were dead. The harbor was an inferno of twisted metal, burning oil, and shattered lives. And yet, amid the wreckage, there was something the Japanese had failed to destroy: the fuel depots, the repair yards, and most importantly, the aircraft carriers which were out at sea that morning. The sleeping giant had been wounded but not killed. And as the fires of Pearl Harbor burned into the night, America's heart hardened. The world had changed forever. The black smoke that rose above Pearl Harbor on December 7th lingered for hours, then for days. It carried with it the smell of burning oil, charred flesh, and the metallic tang of destruction. By mid-afternoon, the fire still raged aboard the USS Arizona and the West Virginia. Lifeboats and small craft moved among the wrecks, pulling half-burned sailors from the water. Some were still alive, many were not. Across the island, the hospitals were overflowing. Makeshift triage centers were set up in schools, churches, and even on golf courses. Doctors and nurses worked without pause, using torn shirts as bandages and seawater to clean wounds. They had never seen anything like it. The once peaceful naval base looked like a vision of hell. Charred ships jutted from the harbor at odd angles, oil slicks caught fire and burned in rainbow colors, and the sound of moaning wounded echoed over the water. The USS Oklahoma had capsized completely, trapping hundreds of men inside. From within her steel hull came the desperate banging of trapped sailors using wrenches and fists to signal for help. Rescue crews rushed to the overturned battleship, cutting through her plates with torches, but every hour mattered. Some were saved. Many were not. By evening, the Japanese planes were gone, leaving behind silence and disbelief. The once invincible Pacific Fleet was now crippled, or so it seemed. At Hickam Field, dozens of American aircraft lay in smoking ruin, their wings twisted, their engines melted. Mechanics moved between wrecks, searching for anything that could still fly. Civilians crowded the hillsides, staring at the harbor below, still unable to grasp that the unthinkable had happened. Some whispered that Japanese troops were about to invade. Others feared spies were among them. That night, the blackout order came. Every light on Oahu was to be extinguished. The island that had woken in sunlight now slept in fear. In the early hours of December 8th, the survivors began to count the dead. 2,403 Americans were gone. Sailors, soldiers, Marines, and civilians. More than 1,000 lay entombed within the twisted wreckage of the USS Arizona, which still burned long after the sun had set. President Roosevelt received the casualty report at the White House. The words were few but heavy. The Pacific Fleet has sustained severe damage. Losses considerable. Attacks sudden and deliberate. For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly he turned to his aide and spoke the words that would define a century. This means war. At dawn in Honolulu, smoke still drifted across the bay. Sailors who had fought through the nightmare began to tell their stories. Men described leaping from decks into flaming water, swimming through fuel fires, dragging comrades to shore. Chaplains moved among the wounded, praying over bodies. Women volunteers arrived with food and bandages. The Red Cross turned every available space into a treatment ward. The air still smelled of oil and blood. Yet, amid the ruin there was resilience. Crews already began salvage work, pumping out flooded ships and patching holes. Mechanics scoured hangars for planes that could still be repaired. The Navy refused to let the fleet die. Back in Washington, D.C., Roosevelt prepared his speech to Congress. The draft in front of him originally read, "A date which will live in world history." He crossed out the phrase and replaced it with 4 words that burned with emotion, "A date which will live in infamy." On December 8th at 12:30 p.m., he stood before Congress, his face grave but steady. The chamber was silent. "Yesterday," he began, "December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." His voice carried through radios across America into homes, factories, and schoolrooms. Mothers wept. Men clenched their fists. The sleeping giant was fully awake now. As Roosevelt finished, the room erupted in thunderous applause. Every senator, every representative, save one, voted to declare war on Japan. The United States was officially at war. In Tokyo, Japanese Prime Minister Tojo Hideki received news of the American declaration. The empire had expected fear, hesitation, negotiation. Instead, they had ignited something unstoppable. Back at Pearl Harbor, the rescue operations continued day and night. Divers descended into the blackened hulls of sunken ships. They worked by feel alone, in darkness so absolute that even their flashlights were useless. Some could hear faint knocking from inside, trapped sailors who had survived the blast but were slowly running out of air. For days, those sounds haunted the harbor. On December 10th, the last of the faint signals faded away. Many rescuers wept openly, knowing the men below were gone. Despite the devastation, hope began to take root. Engineers discovered that several damaged battleships could be refloated and repaired. The USS West Virginia, the California, even the Nevada, each would one day return to service. The Japanese had believed their strike would cripple American power for years. In truth, it had only delayed it for months. And the 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, had been out at sea, spared entirely. That stroke of fortune would change the course of the war. Meanwhile, across the mainland United States, the nation transformed overnight. Factories that once made cars now built tanks and planes. Men lined up at recruiting stations. Women filled the factories, becoming the lifeblood of wartime production. Newspapers across the country printed one headline, "Remember Pearl Harbor." Churches overflowed. Young men from every state, from the cornfields of Iowa to the skyscrapers of New York, swore vengeance. In Hawaii, the mood shifted from shock to defiance. Survivors returned to duty the very next day. Mechanics salvaged machine guns from wrecked aircraft and mounted them on trucks to defend the island. Civilians patrolled the beaches, scanning the horizon for Japanese landings that never came. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, stood at his headquarters overlooking the harbor. Tears welled in his eyes as he looked out over the burning wrecks of his ships. "It was my responsibility," he said quietly. Within weeks, he was relieved of command, a scapegoat for a nation's pain. But the true shift was deeper than any command change. America's identity itself had changed. The nation that had once stood apart from Europe's wars now burned with unity. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor rose a determination that no bomb could extinguish. In the Japanese fleet returning home, pilots celebrated their success, unaware that they had failed to deliver the final blow. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, stood silently on the deck of the flagship Akagi. The men around him cheered, but he could not join them. He gazed out over the dark sea and said softly, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." As night fell again over Pearl Harbor, the fires glowed on the water like floating stars. Survivors gathered quietly, tending to their wounded, whispering prayers for their fallen brothers. The harbor that had once symbolized American strength now became sacred ground, a graveyard and a promise. Out of the smoke, the spirit of a nation began to rise, steel-hard and unbreakable. The awakening of a giant. The morning after the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii no longer felt like paradise. The air still reeked of oil and burned metal. Battleships that had once symbolized the pride of the U.S. Pacific Fleet now lay half-sunken, twisted, and silent. The USS Arizona still burned, her decks glowing red under the ash-gray sky, while divers moved cautiously through oil-slicked waters searching for trapped men. Families of sailors gathered near the harbor's edge, their faces pale with disbelief. Soldiers carried the wounded, doctors worked without rest, and chaplains moved between rows of bodies whispering last prayers. But among the grief, something powerful stirred, a collective realization that America could never again stand apart from the storm consuming the world. Thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., President Franklin D. Roosevelt sat in the Oval Office that night, exhausted but resolute. His hands trembled slightly as he reviewed casualty reports. The news was grim. More than 2,400 Americans dead, nearly 20 ships destroyed or damaged, and hundreds of aircraft lost. Yet within that loss, a fire began to burn. A fire that would reshape history. On December 8, 1941, Roosevelt addressed Congress. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of an entire nation's fury. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the chamber erupted. Every senator, every representative, save one, voted for war against Japan. Across the country, men lined up outside recruiting stations. Farmers, students, steelworkers, and even fathers in their 40s volunteered to fight. They came from cities and small towns, from factories and farms, carrying determination in their hearts and the memory of Pearl Harbor in their minds. Meanwhile, the Japanese High Command believed their mission had succeeded beyond expectation. Admiral Yamamoto's fleet returned home to celebration, hailed as heroes for striking a devastating blow. But Yamamoto himself was silent. He knew too well the spirit of the American people. In his private journal, he wrote words that would prove prophetic. "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." That giant began to move with astonishing speed. Within weeks, U.S. shipyards that had once built luxury liners now forged destroyers and carriers day and night. Aircraft factories produced new planes faster than Japan could replace its losses. Women entered the workforce in record numbers. Rosie the Riveter became the face of a nation at war. Across the Pacific, Japanese pilots who had once ruled the skies began encountering new American fighters. Wildcats, dauntless dive bombers, and later, the mighty Hellcat. Each encounter shifted the balance a little more. Pearl Harbor, meant to cripple America, had instead united it with unstoppable purpose. For the men who had survived that December morning, the war became deeply personal. Many sailors from the wrecked ships later returned to the front lines, some aboard the very vessels raised and repaired from the harbor's depths. The USS West Virginia and USS California rose again, rebuilt and reborn, their guns roaring vengeance at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Survivors of the Arizona carried the memory of fallen comrades into every engagement that followed, their courage echoing across the Pacific from Midway to Iwo Jima. Back home, the attack changed life forever. Families rationed food, children collected scrap metal, and every radio crackled with updates from distant fronts. Posters urged, "Remember Pearl Harbor." It was no longer just a slogan, it was a promise. From that day, every bomb dropped, every mile of ocean crossed, carried the memory of that morning's smoke and flames. December 7th had started as a day of loss, but by the war's end, it became a symbol of endurance. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the men who had once stood helpless on burning decks watched the rising sun flag lowered for the last time. Others saluted in silence, remembering where it all began. The Pacific, once a graveyard, now reflected peace again. And today, when visitors stand at the Pearl Harbor Memorial, looking down at the sunken hull of the Arizona, they can still see oil drops rising from the depths, the tears of the ship, as locals call them. Each shimmer of oil carries the memory of those who fell and those who rose. The attack that was meant to break America instead bounded in unity and resolve. It marked the moment when a sleeping giant opened its eyes and changed the course of the world forever.